The village rested in the shadow of tall hills, surrounded by fields that whispered with the wind, but even in a place where the earth yielded grain and rivers ran with silver clarity, there lived a young orphan girl whose life was marked not by the gentleness of nature but by the cruelty of those who should have cared for her most. Her mother had died when she was very young, and her father, unable to bear loneliness, remarried. The new woman in the household, the stepmother, carried with her a heart heavy with envy and a spirit sharpened with malice. From the beginning, she looked at the girl not as a child deserving of care but as a rival, someone whose very presence unsettled her pride. For the girl was beautiful, not only in the gentle curve of her face or the brightness of her eyes, but in her manner, her voice, and the softness with which she treated even the smallest bird that fell wounded from the sky. That beauty, both of heart and form, became a mirror in which the stepmother saw her own bitterness reflected, and so cruelty became her weapon to silence what she could never match. Each day the girl awoke before dawn to sweep the compound, fetch water, grind the grains and tend to the animals. The stepmother gave no word of gratitude, only sharp commands and harsher punishments if she faltered. Neighbors whispered when they saw the girl bent under heavy loads or standing in the market barefoot and weary. Some pitied her, but none dared interfere, for the stepmother carried a tongue sharp enough to cut reputations and a will strong enough to make others fear her wrath. In the quiet moments, when the girl sat alone by the fire, she would recall her mother's songs, the soft lullabies that once wrapped her in comfort. Now those melodies felt like distant stars, visible but unreachable, shining faintly in the darkness of her sorrow. The stepmother's jealousy grew with each passing season. She saw how people admired the girl, how even in rags she seemed to carry a dignity that no insult could crush. When traders came to the village, they noticed her kindness. When elders gathered, they spoke of her good manners, and when children played, they clung to her because she never raised her voice in anger. These simple acts of grace stoked fires in the stepmother's heart. She could not bear that an orphan, a girl she considered less than the dust beneath her feet, should command such love while she, in all her wealth and power, remained feared but unloved. The girl's stepsister, too, followed her mother's path of cruelty. She mocked the girl's tattered clothes, laughed at her tired hands, and competed for every scrap of attention. Where the girl gave kindness, the stepsister gave scorn. Where the girl offered help, the stepsister sneered. Yet, no matter how much cruelty surrounded her, the orphan did not return it in kind. She bent but did not break, she wept but did not harden. It was as though her heart carried a secret reservoir of patience, something born of suffering but nurtured by hope. Life in the stepmother's house became a daily punishment for her innocence. The girl's purity, her refusal to grow bitter, was itself a crime in the eyes of her tormentors. For those who live with envy cannot bear the light of goodness, it reveals too much of their own darkness. And so, the stepmother devised new tasks, harder trials, sharper words, hoping each would wound the girl deeply enough to extinguish her spirit. But each day, like a plant trampled yet not uprooted, the girl rose again. This resilience enraged her oppressor. The world, it seemed, was unjustly tilted. The wicked grew bold, the kind suffered in silence, and no hand of justice appeared to tip the balance. Yet within this imbalance lay a question that echoed through time, through every cruel act ever committed against the innocent. Why do the cruel always seek to silence the pure? Is it because purity is a mirror that reflects their emptiness, or because innocence carries a power that even cruelty cannot fully destroy? The story of the orphan girl invites us to reflect on this truth. When the heart is untainted, it becomes unbearable for those whose souls are poisoned. To break it is to feel victorious, but to see it survive is to be reminded of one's own weakness. And so, her life became not only her burden but also a lesson for those who watched from afar. The villagers who shook their heads in pity perhaps wondered why goodness is always the target of cruelty. Why must kindness walk barefoot while malice sits clothed in silk? Why must gentle hands bleed while envious hearts feast on comfort? The story unfolds in such a world, where the innocent are tested not once but many times, where every tear shed waters the soil for something unseen, where even the harshest punishment hides the seed of transformation. The girl did not yet know it, but her suffering was leading her toward a moment where cruelty would turn against itself, where the very punishment meant to break her would reveal her hidden power. For in every tale where innocence is oppressed, there comes a point where the world shifts, and the thorns meant to wound become the very flowers that crown the head of the pure. Until that moment, however, she bore her trials in silence, with dignity that could not be taken from her. Her story, like many before and after, begins in pain but carries within it the fragrance of roses yet to bloom. From the moment dawn broke, the orphan girl's life was painted with the cruel brushstrokes of her stepmother's jealousy. Every day began not with tenderness or care, but with the sharp commands of a woman whose heart carried nothing but bitterness. The girl was roused from her straw mat long before the rooster's crow, her body still aching from the previous day's labors. While the stepmother's own daughter still slept soundly, wrapped in soft cloths, the orphan was sent outside barefoot into the biting morning chill, tasked with fetching water before the sun had fully risen. The sharp stones cut into her feet as she made her way to the stream, yet no complaint left her lips. She bore her suffering quietly, her kindness and patience shining even in the face of relentless cruelty. The stepmother seemed to find pleasure in devising new ways to humiliate the girl. Once, when visitors came to their home, she forced the orphan to kneel in the dirt outside, pretending to weed the ground, while her own daughter was dressed in bright cloths and adorned with beads. The girl's hands blistered from working in the sun, her hair tangled with dust, while her stepmother boasted about her true daughter's grace and beauty. Whenever the orphan caught the visitor's pitying gaze, she lowered her eyes, refusing to speak of her suffering. She knew that any attempt to defend herself would only invite harsher punishment later. The cruel woman also took great care to ensure the girl never felt even the smallest comfort. When food was prepared, the stepmother served her own daughter first, heaping her plate with meat and vegetables, while the orphan was given nothing but scraps, sometimes even the bones. On nights when the fire was lit, she was denied the warmth of its glow, instead sent to sleep in the cold corner of the hut where the wind slipped through the cracks. And yet, despite the hunger that gnawed at her stomach and the shivering that kept her awake, the orphan girl whispered quiet prayers to the ancestors, asking only for the strength to endure another day. Barefoot toil became her constant burden. When the midday sun scorched the earth, the stepmother deliberately assigned her the harshest chores. She was ordered to carry bundles of firewood across the burning ground, her feet pressing into thorns and stones, her skin blistering beneath the heat. The stepmother would watch from the shade, a faint smirk on her lips, as though delighting in the girl's suffering. "Perhaps the sun will teach you humility," she would sneer. But humility was never the girl's weakness, it was her strength. While others might have broken under such treatment, she carried her pain with grace, her spirit unbent even as her body was tested to its limits. The cruelty did not end with physical torment. The stepmother also sought to poison the girl's spirit with words. She whispered venom in her ear, telling her she was worthless, that she was unloved, that her parents had left her behind because even they could not bear her presence. Day after day, the orphan was reminded that she was unwanted, a burden, a shadow to be hidden away. The stepmother's daughter, spoiled and arrogant, joined in the torment, mocking her ragged clothes and calling her the barefoot slave. Yet the girl's eyes, though tired and weary, still carried a quiet light that no insult could extinguish. What pained the stepmother most was that no matter how harsh the punishments, no matter how deep the wounds inflicted upon her, the orphan girl did not harden into bitterness. Instead, her heart remained gentle, her kindness unshaken. When her stepmother's daughter fell ill, it was the orphan who stayed awake through the night, wiping her fevered brow and fetching water. When the stepmother herself stumbled one day and twisted her ankle, it was the orphan who rushed to help her stand, though she was repaid with nothing but a slap for daring to touch her. This unyielding kindness only deepened the stepmother's envy. How could this girl, treated worse than an animal, still shine brighter than her own pampered child? Driven by jealousy, the stepmother began to devise crueler tests, determined to break the orphan's spirit once and for all. She would send her to the forest with impossible tasks, to gather bundles of firewood heavier than her small frame could bear, to fetch water from the deepest part of the stream while carrying a cracked gourd that spilled with every step. Each time the orphan returned, bruised and bleeding but never empty-handed. The stepmother seethed at her resilience, her patience, her ability to endure suffering without surrender. But endurance came at a heavy cost. The girl's feet, bare and calloused, were scarred with cuts from the thorns and stones she walked on daily. Her skin bore the marks of endless toil, her hands raw and bleeding from scrubbing and carrying. Yet in her silence, in the way she bore each punishment without complaint, she carried a dignity that no cruelty could erase. And that quiet dignity was the very thing her stepmother could not forgive. So the woman schemed further, her mind twisting with thoughts of how to finally crush the orphan's light. Each day became a test, each chore a trial designed not only to wound her body but to shatter her spirit. Yet the girl endured, her heart whispering to her that even in the harshest of worlds, innocence must not surrender to cruelty. Would the stepmother succeed in extinguishing her light, or would her wickedness only serve to reveal the strength hidden within the orphan's heart? That question lingered like a shadow, waiting for the day when cruelty would push the girl to the edge of despair, and perhaps to the beginning of her destiny. The day came when the stepmother's cruelty reached its sharpest edge, a plan so vicious that even the neighbors whispered that she had gone too far. Yet, the woman's heart was made of stone, and envy burned hotter than reason. She could not stand the sight of the young orphan girl's gentle beauty, nor the quiet strength that seemed to glow from her despite all the suffering she endured. Every punishment she had inflicted, carrying pots of water until her shoulders bruised, scrubbing floors until her fingers bled, standing hungry while others feasted, had failed to break the girl's spirit. And so, in her bitterness, the stepmother devised a command that was meant not just to humiliate, but to destroy. She summoned the girl one afternoon when the sun was cruelest, its fire pressing against the earth as though determined to set the soil aflame. The woman's eyes gleamed with malice as she pointed toward the edge of the village, where she had laid a path covered in thorns, long, sharp, and freshly cut from the wild bushes that grew in the forest's heart. "You," she said coldly, her voice carrying like a whip across the compound, "will walk barefoot upon this path of thorns, step by step until you reach the end. If you falter, if you cry, or if you refuse, you will never again eat from this household. You will wander as a beggar and starve under the open sky." The villagers who overheard gasped. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, while elders shook their heads in disbelief. Yet none dared to intervene, for the stepmother held power in her tongue and cruelty in her hands. Some came quietly, drawn by curiosity and the promise of a spectacle. By the time the girl was led to the path, a crowd had gathered, murmuring among themselves. Some pitied her. Others wanted to see if the girl's patience would finally shatter. The path itself was a merciless sight. Hundreds of thorns, some as long as a finger, glistened in the sunlight like the teeth of hidden beasts. The earth beneath was hard and dry, offering no softness to cushion her feet. The girl's heart pounded, but her face remained calm, her eyes lowered not in fear but in quiet prayer. "Walk," the stepmother commanded, folding her arms across her chest. Her lips curved into a smile, certain that this time the girl's kindness and endurance would meet their end. The orphan girl took a deep breath. She looked at the path stretching before her, then at the crowd. She saw faces twisted in pity, some in cruel amusement. And then she looked at the sky. The vast blue seemed to whisper back to her, reminding her that even the sun, though hot and harsh, gave light and life. She stepped forward. The first thorn pierced her heel, sharp and merciless. She felt the sting shoot through her entire body, yet she did not cry out. Blood welled up, staining the ground, but she lifted her other foot and placed it down again. Another thorn, another wound. A gasp rose from the crowd. The stepmother's smile widened. "Yes," she thought, "bleed, little one. Break, little one." But the girl kept walking. Step after step, thorn after thorn, each one cutting, tearing, burning. Her feet were soon crimson, her steps marked by droplets of blood that glistened in the dust. Yet her face remained serene, her eyes lifted upward as though she drew strength from something beyond the sight of men. Children in the crowd began to weep quietly, clutching their mother's arms. An old woman whispered, "She is not walking alone. The ancestors walk with her." Others nodded, for there was something unearthly in the way the girl bore the pain, not with bitterness, not with anger, but with a grace that seemed to shame the cruelty of the world. Halfway through the path, her knees trembled. She swayed, nearly falling, but caught herself. Her breath grew heavy, sweat mingling with the blood on her skin. The stepmother leaned forward, eager to see her collapse. But the girl pressed on. She remembered her mother's words, spoken long ago before sickness carried her away. "When the world cuts you, do not become a blade. When the world burns you, do not become the fire. Hold fast to who you are, and the heavens themselves will remember you." With each step, she whispered those words to herself, like a song carried only by her heart. When she reached the final stretch, the crowd fell silent. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to still. The thorns had done their worst, yet the girl's spirit had not broken. At last, with bloodied feet and trembling limbs, she placed her final step beyond the cruel path. She stood tall, breathing hard, her face lifted toward the sky. The villagers erupted, not with laughter, not with mockery, but with awe. Some clapped their hands to their mouths. Others bowed their heads. Never before had they seen such strength in silence, such power in patience. The stepmother, however, burned with rage. Her plan had failed. Instead of shame, the girl had won the hearts of those who witnessed. Her cruelty had become the stage upon which the girl's endurance shone brighter than the sun itself. Still, she refused to accept defeat. Her eyes narrowed as she hissed to herself, "This is not the end. There are cruelties yet that can crush her." But in that moment, as the crowd whispered of miracles and resilience, the young orphan girl had already transformed. What was meant to humiliate her had instead revealed her strength. What was meant to silence her had instead made her story echo through every heart present. The thorns had not broken her, they had crowned her. When the cruel command was given, and the girl's feet pressed down upon the merciless thorns, blood welled and stained the earth. Each droplet carried not only her pain but the story of every humiliation she had borne in silence. Yet, as her crimson tears of suffering fell upon the dry path, something extraordinary began to stir. Where pain should have deepened, where agony should have flourished, roses began to blossom in defiance of cruelty. At first, it was just a single bud pushing through the earth, tender petals unfurling beneath the harsh gaze of the crowd. But then with each step she took, the thorns melted into blooms, vivid red, soft pink and radiant white, rising where sharp barbs once awaited to cut her flesh. The ground became a living carpet of roses, turning the place of humiliation into a path of divine wonder. The villagers gasped in unison, unable to believe what their eyes witnessed. Women covered their mouths with trembling hands, elders leaned forward on their walking sticks, and children's wide eyes glittered with awe. Murmurs surged through the gathering like wind rushing across fields. "She walks on roses, her suffering births beauty. This is not of men but of the ancestors or perhaps the gods themselves." Those who had mocked her silence, those who had pitied her misery, now stood transfixed, seeing that her spirit had been cradled by a power beyond human malice. The roses were not merely flowers, they were living witnesses, proclaiming that no cruelty could strip her of the blessing she carried within. The stepmother, who had awaited screams of pain and pleas for mercy, faltered as her lips curled into disbelief. She had expected the child to collapse, broken and bloodied, in front of all who gathered, but instead she saw her walk with quiet dignity, her face serene, her body glowing with a grace no whip or scorn could erase. The roses followed her, each step transforming humiliation into honor. It was as though the earth itself rejected the cruelty forced upon her and embraced her suffering as sacred. The sharpness of the thorns dulled, giving way to petals soft as whispers, each one glistening with dew that seemed drawn from the heavens. The girl, though her feet bled still, felt a strength rising within her, a calm assurance that her pain had never been in vain. Every task she had endured, every moment of sun-scorched labor, every insult and bruise, none had gone unseen. She felt as though the roses carried her story, blooming as proof that suffering met with patience could birth miracles. Though her body trembled, she walked forward with unbroken resolve, her eyes lifted, not to her stepmother, not to the jeering crowd that had fallen silent, but toward the unseen force that had chosen her as its vessel. The fragrance of roses filled the air, rich and sweet, settling into the lungs of all present. It softened hearts hardened by gossip, and it pricked the conscience of those who had turned their faces away when she needed compassion. The men who had once laughed at her bare feet now lowered their heads in shame. The women who had whispered of her worthlessness now wiped silent tears from their eyes. Even the children who had mocked her ragged clothes, now reached out with tiny hands, longing to touch the roses she left behind. The scene became more than a spectacle, it was a revelation, a truth unveiled through blood and petals. The girl's stepmother clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms until they nearly bled. The miracle unraveled her schemes before all. Where she had meant to destroy the girl's spirit, she had instead elevated her in the eyes of the village. No trick, no cruelty, no calculated act of humiliation had triumphed. Instead, the very tools of torment had been turned into instruments of wonder. The path she had prepared as a stage of mockery had become the sacred ground of a living miracle. The stepmother's face burned, her pride collapsing under the weight of something she could not control. Step by step, the girl reached the end of the thorny path, which was now a radiant trail of roses. She turned and looked back, seeing the ground transformed as though heaven itself had kissed the earth. Her blood mingled with beauty, her pain reborn as hope. The villagers knelt without being commanded, as if instinct drove them to bow before the unseen power that had chosen her. Some whispered prayers, some uttered blessings, others simply stared in silence, overwhelmed by what they had witnessed. The girl, though humble, felt no pride, only gratitude that her suffering had not been wasted, that the cruelty meant to destroy her had revealed her as chosen. From that day the tale spread beyond the village. Traders carried it across rivers and mountains, singers wove it into songs, and mothers whispered it into the ears of their children, that a girl had walked upon thorns and roses had sprung beneath her feet. Wherever the story was told, it carried the lesson that the pure of heart cannot be defeated by cruelty, for even their wounds could bloom into blessings. The villagers who had seen it with their own eyes became living witnesses, forever marked by the memory of roses blooming in place of thorns. The girl's feet bore scars, yet those scars became her crown, proof of what she had endured and overcome. Each mark on her skin reminded her of that sacred day, when her suffering was not only ended but transformed into beauty. In the silence of her heart, she whispered thanks, not to those who had wronged her, but to the power that had carried her through. And though her stepmother continued to fume, plotting still, the miracle had already woven itself into the hearts of the people. No longer could she be dismissed as worthless, no longer could her suffering be hidden in shadows. The roses had spoken, and their voice was eternal. The stepmother could feel her heart pounding in her chest as the whispers of the crowd began to swell like waves crashing against rocks. The girl's feet, though torn and bleeding, left not a trail of agony as she had intended, but instead a path of roses that dazzled under the sun's golden rays. The villagers pressed closer, their eyes wide, their voices trembling with awe. What was meant to be humiliation had become a spectacle of divine wonder. For the first time, the stepmother's control over the people's perception faltered, and she felt the fragile thread of power slipping from her grasp. Her lips curled into a forced smile, but her hands trembled with rage as she pointed toward the miraculous path. "This is no blessing," she spat, her voice sharp as broken glass. "It is sorcery. Trickery. She has deceived you all." But even as her words pierced the air, they found no ground to stand upon. The villagers did not nod in agreement as they once did. Instead, they looked at her with suspicion, their eyes narrowing, their whispers thick with doubt. They saw her not as a protective guardian but as a jealous woman desperate to destroy a girl whose innocence had shone brighter than cruelty could smother. Her mind burned with fury, for she had spent years weaving lies, turning the villagers against the girl, branding her cursed, unworthy, and weak. Yet now, with every rose blooming from her suffering, those lies dissolved like smoke in the wind. She clenched her fists, her nails biting into her palms until they drew blood. "Do not be fooled by these illusions," she screamed, her voice rising higher, breaking under the weight of desperation. "The spirits punish us for tolerating such witchcraft. This is an abomination, not a miracle." But the villagers only shook their heads. Some murmured prayers under their breath, believing the girl was chosen by the ancestors, a vessel of purity that no hatred could stain. A few even fell to their knees, bowing before the roses that had replaced the thorns, gathering petals as if they carried blessings. The stepmother's face twisted at the sight. Her authority, her carefully crafted mask of respect, crumbled in the eyes of those who once obeyed her commands without question. Her rage deepened when she saw the villagers draw away from her and toward the girl. The same people who had mocked and shunned the orphan now reached out their hands to her with reverence, whispering apologies and blessings. The stepmother could not bear it. Every step the girl took forward felt like a dagger twisting into her chest. It was not just roses that bloomed, it was the unraveling of everything she had built. "No!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into madness. She pushed through the crowd, her eyes wild, her hair loose, her body trembling with fury. She seized a handful of roses, crushing them in her fist, hoping to prove they were an illusion, but the soft petals remained in her grip, their fragrance stronger than her rage. She flung them to the ground, stamping upon them, yet they only scattered and shone brighter under the sunlight. The villagers gasped, not at the roses but at her, their once respected woman, now reduced to a furious spectacle, stamping like a mad beast upon beauty that could not be destroyed. Jealousy, once hidden behind her calculated cruelty, now erupted in full force. Her eyes darted back to the girl, who stood silently, her face serene despite her bleeding feet. The girl's silence, her calm, only fueled the fire of the stepmother's fury. To her, that silence was mockery, a reminder that no matter how much she tried to break her, the girl's spirit remained unbroken. Her voice cracked as she screamed again, this time not at the crowd but at the heavens themselves. "Why her? Why not me? I am the one who deserves honor. I am the one who deserves blessings." Her screams echoed through the village square, her words dripping with venom. The crowd stared in horror. No longer did they see a wronged woman pointing at sorcery, they saw a soul consumed by envy, a heart blackened by hatred so deep it could not bear the sight of another's grace. Children hid behind their mothers. Elders shook their heads, their disappointment heavy. For the first time the truth became undeniable. She was not a protector but a tormentor. She was not righteous but poisoned by jealousy. Her final weapon, her ability to manipulate the people's hearts, had been stripped away. She felt the walls closing in, the weight of rejection pressing against her chest. Still, she fought, clawing for control as if her very life depended on it. She turned to her daughter, the stepsister, her last hope, and shouted, "Tell them! Tell them it is witchcraft." But even the stepsister faltered, her face pale, her eyes darting away in shame. No one came to her defense. She stood utterly alone. Rage consumed her like fire, blistering through her veins, burning away any remnant of composure she once held. She lunged toward the girl, her hands trembling with the urge to tear away the roses, to silence her once and for all. But the villagers held her back, not out of cruelty but out of fear, fear of what her jealousy had made her become. Their grip on her arms felt like chains, and for the first time she realized she was not the master of the story anymore. Her plan had not only failed, it had exposed her soul to all. The girl's blood had written truth upon the earth, and roses had carried it to the eyes of everyone present. As the stepmother thrashed against their hold, screaming curses and accusations, her voice lost power. It was no longer the commanding tone of authority but the shrill cry of a woman undone. The villagers looked upon her with pity, and pity was the last thing her pride could endure. She had sought to humiliate the orphan, but in the end, it was she who stood humiliated, stripped of dignity, naked in her rage before the people she once ruled. The roses bloomed brighter, the air fragrant with a purity that mocked her bitterness. The girl's feet bled, but her spirit glowed. The stepmother's envy turned her into a figure of ruin, and no matter how she screamed, no one believed her anymore. The elders gathered beneath the great tree at the center of the village, a place where judgments had been passed for generations. The entire community assembled, their faces filled with awe from what they had witnessed and heavy with the weight of what had to be decided. The girl stood quietly, her feet still leaving behind roses where she walked, though she did her best to hide them under the hem of her worn dress. The stepmother stood apart, her face twisted with fury, her voice ready to spit venom at anyone who dared to speak against her. But the people were no longer afraid of her sharp tongue. They had seen too much, and the truth stood before them, undeniable as the blossoms covering the path of the orphan girl. The eldest among the council, his back bent but his voice firm, raised his hand for silence. "We are gathered to judge a matter that touches the heart of our community. It concerns cruelty, lies, and the blessing of the ancestors themselves." His eyes settled on the stepmother, then on the girl. "Each voice here will be heard." One by one the villagers began to speak. An old woman rose first, leaning on her staff. She recounted how many times she had seen the orphan girl come to fetch water not for herself, but for others. Even when her hands were raw from carrying heavy pots, she would still stop to help those weaker than herself. "Her heart has never been bitter," the woman said. "Even when treated like a slave in her own home, she carried herself with gentleness. How can one so pure be accused of sorcery? No, what we see is a blessing from above." Then a young mother stood, a baby tied to her back. Her voice shook with emotion as she recalled how the orphan girl had shared her only piece of bread with her during a famine, when her own stomach was empty. Who shares their last meal unless their soul is full of kindness? She has always given while her stepmother took. We cannot be blind to the difference. A hunter rose next, his arms scarred from years of labor. He testified how he once saw the stepmother strike the girl with a stick so hard that she fell into the dirt. "I said nothing then," he admitted, lowering his head in shame, "but I cannot stay silent now. I saw cruelty with my own eyes." The voices continued, each villager stepping forward to bear witness. They spoke of the stepmother's greed, her harsh words, the way she twisted truth and made the innocent girl suffer. They spoke of how the stepmother and her own daughter dressed in fine clothes while the orphan wore rags, how she was denied proper food yet still managed to smile at others. The girl's quiet endurance had not gone unnoticed, though many had been too afraid to confront the stepmother until now. With every testimony, the stepmother's face grew redder, her body trembling with rage. She shouted that they were all liars, that the roses were the work of dark spirits, that the girl had tricked them with forbidden magic. But each denial only made her look more desperate, her words like the flailing of someone drowning in her own bitterness. Finally, the eldest turned his eyes to the stepmother. "You have heard the words of your people," he said. "Do you deny them all? Do you take no responsibility for your deeds?" The stepmother's voice was shrill as she spat back. "This child is cursed. She has deceived you all with her false sweetness. You are blind, all of you. Blind to the danger that she brings." Her words rang hollow against the sight of roses blooming under the girl's feet, roses that smelled of peace and purity rather than corruption. The council exchanged long looks, their decision already heavy in their hearts. The elder spoke once more, his voice carrying finality. A woman who cannot see goodness in the purest of souls, a woman who strikes down the innocent and feeds only her envy, has no place among us. The ancestors have spoken through the miracle we have seen today. The girl is blessed, and you are cursed by your own cruelty. Murmurs of agreement swept through the crowd. Some people shouted, others wept, and many nodded gravely. The judgment was clear. The stepmother would be banished, cast out from the village she had poisoned with her malice. She cried out in protest, clawing at the air, but no one stepped forward to defend her. Even her own daughter looked away, ashamed and afraid. The orphan girl stood silently, her eyes lowered, not gloating over the fate of her tormentor but filled with quiet sorrow that things had come to this. Still, she knew justice had been done. The elders announced the sentence, and the villagers led the stepmother away, her screams echoing through the air like the cries of a wild bird losing its wings. In her absence, the village felt lighter, as if a great shadow had been lifted. The people turned their eyes to the orphan girl, not with pity but with reverence. She had suffered cruelty, yet the earth itself had risen to honor her. Where thorns once tore her flesh, roses now bloomed in abundance. From that day forward, the story of the trial became legend. Parents told their children that cruelty would never go unjudged, and that those who harmed the pure of heart would face the wrath not only of people but of the ancestors themselves. The roses that bloomed in the orphan girl's steps became a symbol of justice in the village, a reminder that truth always rises, even from blood and pain. And though the girl had no family to shield her, she now had an entire community that stood by her, recognizing at last the worth they had overlooked for so long. The elder's judgment marked the turning point, but what followed was something even the orphan girl herself had never dared to dream. For so long she had been treated as an unwanted shadow, mocked for her torn clothes, beaten for small mistakes, and starved so that others could feast. Yet the same people who once turned away now looked upon her with new eyes, as if the veil of neglect had been lifted and they could finally see who she truly was. Word of the miracle spread beyond her village. Those who had doubted, who had whispered cruel names, now bowed their heads in respect whenever she passed. Mothers began to call their children away from games in the dust, just so they could stand still and greet her. To the villagers, she was no longer the unwanted orphan. She had become a living reminder that the ancestors watched over the just and would always bring truth into the light, no matter how deep the darkness tried to bury it. The elders led the way, acknowledging openly that she had been wronged. They decreed that what was once denied to her must now be restored. Gifts poured into her hut, baskets filled with cassava, calabashes of milk, jars of honey, fine beads, and cloth dyed with the richest earth colors. One hunter offered her the skin of a leopard, a rare token of honor reserved only for those believed to walk closely with the spirits. A group of women who had once mocked her bare feet now brought her sandals carefully woven from strong hide. For the first time in her life, she was clothed not in shame but in dignity. Marriage proposals followed almost immediately. Young men of the village, and even strangers who traveled after hearing her story, sought her hand. They were captivated not just by her beauty, which hardship had never stolen, but by the aura of blessing that surrounded her. To marry her, they believed, was to marry a future filled with abundance and favor. Yet when she listened to these proposals, her heart remained still. She did not look upon them with disdain, but with a gentle patience. She knew that love born from sudden admiration was not the kind of love she had longed for during the years when no one cared. So she thanked them with humility, neither mocking their hopes nor accepting hastily. The change in the village was not only in how they treated her, but in how they began to change themselves. Families who once ignored suffering now took care to share food with the poor, remembering how they had watched her starve in silence. Children who once copied their mother's cruelty by calling her names, now followed her eagerly when she walked to the stream. They asked her to tell them stories, and she used those moments to remind them of the importance of kindness. Her life itself had become a teaching, one stronger than any tale sung by griots. Despite all the honors, she never allowed pride to rule her heart. Each gift she received she shared. When baskets of cassava arrived, she divided them among widows and those who had many mouths to feed. The fine cloth she received, she cut into pieces to clothe children who had none. Even the leopard skin she placed not in her hut to boast of wealth, but at the shrine of the ancestors as a thanksgiving for their protection. Her humility only deepened the villagers' reverence for her. They began to call her the daughter of the ancestors, a title that carried weight far greater than any crown. When people asked her what she wished for, her answer was never about riches or power. She said she wished only that no other child would suffer as she had suffered. These words touched the elders, who then began to shape new rules for the village. They decreed that orphans must be cared for by all, not just left at the mercy of one household. They established days where the whole community brought food and gifts to children who had no parents, ensuring that no one was forgotten again. Her pain, once dismissed, now became the seed of a new compassion in the community. Travelers carried her story from one village to another. At markets, traders spoke of the orphan girl who turned ashes into blessings. In distant places, her name was sung in work songs. Some claimed she was a spirit born in human form, sent to remind people of the balance between cruelty and justice. Others believed she would one day become a great queen. Yet for all these rumors, she remained as she was, a girl who chose kindness over bitterness. As the seasons changed, her influence grew. Young girls who had once been ashamed of their scars or hardships began to look up to her, realizing that suffering could carve strength, not shame. Women admired her wisdom and came to her for counsel, even those much older than her. Men, though still drawn by her beauty, came to respect her leadership and fairness more than they desired her hand. In a world where power was often hoarded, she gave it freely to the powerless. Her hut, once a place of loneliness, became a gathering point. At dawn, children would sit at her doorway, waiting for her to share words of guidance before the day began. At dusk, elders sometimes joined her to hear her thoughts on disputes. She spoke little, but when she did, her words carried the weight of truth. People said her voice sounded as though the ancestors themselves were speaking through her. Even in her quiet moments, when she sat alone by the stream or under the shade of a great tree, she prayed not for herself but for her village. She asked the ancestors to heal the wounds of those who still carried bitterness, to bless the soil so that no one would hunger again, and to guard the hearts of children from cruelty. This devotion was what set her apart. Power had come to her, but she had no desire to use it for revenge or vanity. She carried it like one carries water in a calabash, carefully, with balance, never spilling, never wasting. By the time another harvest came, no one in the village remembered her as the orphan who once swept the yard in rags. They remembered her as the girl who bore suffering with grace and turned it into a blessing for everyone. Songs were made in her honor, not because she demanded it, but because people could not help but celebrate the change she brought into their lives. Even neighboring chiefs heard of her, and some sent messengers with gifts, hoping for alliances. Yet she remained in her village, close to the people who had finally learned to see her worth. Her rise was not just a story of personal triumph. It became the foundation of a new way of life for her people. She showed them that true honor did not come from wealth or titles, but from humility, compassion, and strength born out of hardship. And though she could have claimed glory for herself, she chose instead to lift others, ensuring that her blessing did not end with her alone but became the light for an entire community. In the seasons that followed the banishment of the stepmother, the village could not remain the same. Whispers of what had transpired spread quickly, carried by traders, drummers, and wandering storytellers. At first it was told as a cautionary tale of wickedness punished by the elders. But as the years unfolded, the story transformed into something more, an echo that crossed rivers, mountains, and far-off villages. Children who had never met the orphan girl repeated her name in hushed awe. Elders invoked her story whenever cruelty began to fester in the hearts of kin. Women who had been oppressed found courage in her survival, and men who carried arrogance in their bones trembled at the thought of ancestral justice. The tale became more than a memory, it became a legend. The birth of the folktale. Griots and drummers composed songs about her, their voices rising under the moonlight, singing of the girl who suffered yet rose above her pain. Bruises may bleed, but they also bloom, the singers declared. Each word carried weight, for it was no longer about a single girl but about every soul who endured cruelty in silence. The young girls of the village played in circles, chanting her name as they braided each other's hair. They tied flowers to their wrists and whispered, "Innocence cannot be buried by cruelty." Mothers told their children the story before sleep, their voices soft as though laying blessings into the hearts of the young. Soon, neighboring clans took the tale as their own. Some said the ancestors had sent the girl as a test to reveal the greed of the wicked. Others claimed she was the child of a forgotten spirit, placed among mortals so they might learn the balance between good and evil. Regardless of interpretation, no village could remain untouched by her legend. The symbol of resilience. The orphan girl herself, though she had become honored and cherished in her lifetime, never boasted of her fate. She walked humbly among her people, greeting both the old and the young with kindness. When asked about her suffering, she would only smile softly and say, "Pain teaches the heart to listen." Her wounds had healed, but the memory of cruelty had not faded. Instead of bitterness, she carried it like fire in her chest, a fire that gave light to others who had been beaten down by the world. When a widow cried for the land her husband's brothers tried to steal, the girl spoke for her. When a child was mocked for being poor, she offered food and comfort. When the village squabbled over inheritance, she reminded them that wealth meant nothing if ancestors turned their faces away. She became not just a girl but a living symbol, proof that pain could be transformed into strength and cruelty into wisdom. The expansion of the legend. Generations later, her story grew even larger, embroidered by the tongues of storytellers. Some claimed she had the power to make flowers grow wherever her tears fell. Others said that when she walked past a dying tree, it blossomed again, for her heart carried the breath of the ancestors. Though exaggerated, these stories carried truths hidden in their symbols. She had indeed turned sorrow into beauty, and where she walked, broken spirits rose with hope. The moral for generations. The moral of her story was etched into the hearts of those who heard it. Cruelty always exposes itself. No matter how carefully the wicked cloak their deeds, their greed, envy, and malice eventually rise like smoke through the cracks. The stepmother believed her lies and punishments would bury the girl, but instead, they revealed her own darkness for all to see. Purity transforms pain into beauty. The orphan girl did not return cruelty with cruelty. She did not allow her suffering to poison her spirit. Instead, she let it shape her into a vessel of compassion, so much so that the very blows meant to destroy her became the foundation of her honor. This truth lived on long after her body returned to the earth. Parents reminded quarreling children with her story, chiefs warned greedy men with her memory, and lovers seeking to wed were advised to learn from her resilience and patience. Eternal in memory. Time is a river that washes away the names of kings and chiefs, but the orphan girl's name was never drowned. It lingered in songs, dances, and tales told around fires. Her story became a ritual at festivals, performed through masked dances that showed her suffering and her triumph. Drummers would beat slowly to imitate her tears, then rise into thunder as she triumphed against cruelty. In this way she became eternal. Not as flesh and bone, but as a spirit that lived in memory, woven into the fabric of her people. To the generations that followed, she was more than human, she was the embodiment of resilience and divine justice. The lasting symbol. To this day, when storms gather over villages, elders remind the young, even lightning that strikes can give light to the night. Even wounds can give birth to healing. And then they tell her story again. When a child cries for mistreatment, they say, "Remember the girl whose bruises bloomed." When someone is wronged, they whisper, "Cruelty cannot bury blessings." And when someone rises from hardship with dignity, the people proclaim, "She walks in the footsteps of the orphan girl." Thus, her life, her pain, and her triumph became not only a story but a guide. Closing reflection. The legend ends with a truth carried through countless mouths and hearts. Bruises may bleed, but they also bloom. Innocence cannot be buried by cruelty. For cruelty is a fire that consumes itself, while purity is water that nourishes the earth. In the end, the ancestors see all, and justice may sleep, but it never dies. And so the orphan girl, once bruised and forgotten, rose into the timeless memory of her people. She became not only a daughter of her village but a daughter of the earth itself, eternal in story, eternal in meaning.